Hello and welcome to ORF's new discussion, where we discuss today Afghanistan and the regional impact the Taliban takeover has had. Well, it's been 5 months since the government of Afghanistan collapsed and the Taliban came to power in Kabul. Since then, Afghanistan faces a worsening humanitarian crisis, in addition to a brutal winter, a disturbing economic crisis, severe food shortages, people who have not been paid their salaries, rising unemployment, limited cash reserves. As we're recording this conversation, senior Taliban leaders are in Norway meeting with representatives from the US, the UK, and other European nations as they push them to make accommodations on matters of human rights in return for the unfreezing of Afghan assets, which are desperately needed at this point. While such diplomacy will most likely continue for a couple of months, what impact has the Taliban coming to power had on nations in South Asia? What impact will it have on Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Maldives, Myanmar, and India? And what are our options going forward? To discuss this, I'm joined by a stellar panel. Mohammed Sinan Siyak, who is a visiting fellow at ORF, Rami Desai, who is a conflict analyst and is the former director of the Northeast Policy Institute, Dr. Shahab Khan, who is a professor at the Jahangirnagar University in Dhaka, and Dr. Azam Zahir, who teaches at the University of Western Australia. Thank you so much for joining me today. Sinan, if we could just start with you. Could you give us your understanding, just a general take about how the US withdrawal from Afghanistan, how has India been dealing with that? We often say that, India is waiting and watching. Could you break that down? What sort of questions are we considering while we are waiting? And what are we watching out for at this time?
So essentially, something to consider, and thanks for the introduction. But essentially, the something to consider when we look at the Afghanistan situation for India is to think back about our own history in terms of the Kashmiri insurgency, as well as people moving over to Afghanistan to join militancies over there, right? So in the 1980s and the late 1980s, we had the situation where people from Kashmir had crossed over into Pakistan, into Afghanistan, and there was a lot of training that took place, specifically because of a lot of the Mujahideen who had been fighting with the Soviet Union at that point. They were involved in training a lot of Kashmiris, which then sparked off the insurgency in Kashmir. Now, that is the number one concern that Indian authorities would have to be, considering, and I'm sure are considering at this point, given that this is what happened last time 30 years back. And right now, even though the Kashmiri insurgency has been sort of on a slow simmer, you can still, you can still have this fear that at the end of the day, there could be that sort of cross training that takes place, right? So that's number one. The other aspect to also consider is that you had a lot of groups like the Lashkar-e-Taiba as well as Jaish-e-Mohammed, which were sort of like, they came in the aftermath or within the insurgency against, the Soviet Union. And these groups were, after the Afghanistan, like, after the Soviet Union's withdrawal from Afghanistan at that point, they decided to train their sights on Kashmir again. So you had not just people going from Kashmir, but also people from other countries like Pakistan looking into Kashmir at that point, deciding that, okay, all this training that we've taken and all this experience that our members have is now going to be focused on India, right? So that's number two. So the third thing that we need to look at is transnational groups. And when I'm talking about transnational jihadist groups specifically, I'm looking at the Islamic State as well as Al Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent, which is the South Asian branch of Al Qaeda. Now, the Islamic State it's important for India because at one point we had people from Kerala who had shifted over to Afghanistan specifically, not to Iraq, not to Syria, which was the heartland of the Islamic State, but to Afghanistan, where after a certain amount of time, we even had reports of one of these Indians actually taking part in an attack in Kabul. So that is something very important because down the line, you may see more people who are interested in the Islamic State thinking of going over to Afghanistan because it's also slightly easier to move over to Afghanistan. The other aspect to consider is Al Qaeda, which is closely aligned with the Taliban, right? And they have been celebrating the Taliban's so-called success, against the United States, specifically since 2020, like around mid 2020, they changed their propaganda magazine's name from Nawai Ghazwat Afghanistan, if I got that right, to Nawai Ghazwat Hind, which is essentially they moved it from Afghanistan to India, right? The focus shifted from Afghanistan to India. And that sort of gives us an idea of where Al Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent is going to be focusing on. Recently, they had a third issue, and before this, they also included two videos. They released two videos specifically asking Indian Muslims to, conduct violence, to go up against the government, and have many other targets in India. So these are certain. The fact is, because Al Qaeda has safe haven at this point, and Al Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent is not going to be targeted as much with the Taliban, and whatever the Taliban have told about not giving any safe haven to Al Qaeda, there has still been proven links between them, whereas it's been found out that they haven't really cut ties with them, right? So because of all of these factors, we know that Al Qaeda will have a lot of space to think and evaluate and also plan out its attacks, and therein lies the last risk that we can think of, specifically when it comes to the Taliban being present in Afghanistan and what happens for Indians from there.
Mhm. Rami, there's of course this fear that Sinan is talking about how the Taliban coming to power, it sort of empowers these transnational groups. Would you agree with that assessment? And what does the Taliban victory mean for Kashmir, or particularly the northeast part of India?
I, of course, agree with what Sinan has said. His analysis has been fairly precise. But, we have to understand the Northeast is a very complex region to begin with, There is a certain amount of focus that we've always had on the Northwestern frontier, but the Northeastern frontier has never been looked upon or had a lot of interest in it, So that's why I think it would be wise for us to look at the Northeastern frontier too as a entry point for this sort of impact, And, having said that, right after Taliban came into power, it was reported that many sympathizers were caught in the Northeast, making their way to Afghanistan. A lot of them were caught coming in from Bangladesh. Now, the route that they chose was the Northeast because of obviously the geographical proximity, and even the chief minister of Assam at that point said that a substantial number of youths from one particular religious community are missing and have joined terrorist outfits. But, I find because the region is so complex, it has seen a varied amount of insurgent groups, that are operating not just from Myanmar, but at times they have not at times, but largely they have also received support geographically from Bangladesh. It makes it a very peculiar situation and makes it a very precarious position for us to be in, We are lucky in a way that we have a friendly secular government in Bangladesh led by Sheikh Hasina, with a zero tolerance policy towards terrorism. And she has come down hard on radical Islamist ecosystems. Unfortunately, I find that they still do have groups like Hifazat-e-Islam, which controls a huge network of madrasas. And they have been known to unleash violent protests previously, whether it was protesting against the Prime Minister of India's Bangladesh visit, or whether it was against statues that were being erected. They too are driven and driven by the Sharia and insist on blasphemy laws, and have support from BNP and Jamaat-e-Islami, many of whose leaders are on Hifazat's national committee and have strong connections with Islamist terrorist groups like Huji or JMB. In India, Jamaat-e-Islami Hind, and we must not forget all Jamaats, are interconnected, most recently objected to the Surya Namaskar on Republic Day, calling it idolatrous. Its offshoot Jamaat-e-Islami Jammu and Kashmir, if you remember, was banned for having terror connections and networks in 2019. Moreover, so they've also been known to be close associates of PFI in India. And I think we are all aware of what PFI's antecedents and the antics have been, but the HIB is, working inside Bangladesh as, if I may say so, as overground activists of Al-Qaeda and ISIS affiliated organizations, such as JMB or APT. You see the existence of radicalization from Bangladesh in India's eastern flank, on their northeastern frontier, has always been a matter of concern. It might not have been that much in the public domain or in the media, but for observers, it's always been a point of concern. And you see, the demography helps. The demography helps because the demographic jungles of this region have been a virtual getaway for Islamists and militants who once inside have found safe havens with their own kind. This is nothing new. And therefore, I feel that this sort of impact that the Taliban coming into power, that the Bangladesh may see, even though it has a dispensation that has been tough on terror outfits, is because I see two Bangladeshes. I see one which is secular in nature, which believes in Bengali nationalism, and I see another one which actually does identify itself with the Islamist world and is rabidly anti-Indian. And I also see a lack of secular opposition, and I would love to hear more about how that is perceived by my very esteemed co-panelist from Bangladesh. But, to add further, I find that this support to radical groups in India from Bangladesh is something that we should learn from a previous experience. Security in the Northeast has been subverted previously. And with its aid to ULFA, NDFB, NLFT, NSCNIM, and to other Islamist groups functioning in the region, the threat from Bangladesh in the future would be its Talibanization in tandem with what ISI is constructing for the Northeast through Bangladesh. And if that's not something that's apparent today, I think it will be apparent soon enough. This is something we've seen ISI functioning out of Bangladesh. We've seen them giving training. We've seen them giving strategic asset support to insurgent groups from the Northeast. And that sort of revival may very well be possible. Finally, I just think Bangladesh's proximity with the Northeast region is very unique with geography, religion, and it also has a socio-political dilemma, which the Northeast has, which Assam has, and so do some of the other states, not all of them. And I think that makes for a really explosive sort of situation.
Professor Khan, Rami has really set you up to share your thoughts, but of course, we know about the impact that radicalization in Bangladesh has on India. We know about Pakistan's role in Bangladesh. What are your thoughts on how you see the security situation in Bangladesh proceeding in the next couple of months and couple of years? And how is Bangladesh impacted by happenings in Kabul?
Thank you very much. I was quite fascinated to hear Rami. Even that was a wake-up call for me. If that is the perception that is prevailing in Northeast India, probably we really have to rethink a lot of stuff. The first thing is, I was quite intrigued to hear the way ISI is functioning in Bangladesh. Apparently, Bangladesh hasn't done much in its security ground as well as its social ecosystem. Perhaps it is the only country, may I remind, that still has the stability alive, which it doesn't have really been seen as a country that has been exporting the crisis of secularism at all. Now, here comes the problem. The first issue is the connecting Bangladesh with Northeast India is definitely worth exploring when it comes to Afghanistan. Because even if you look at, technology in terms of social media and the social discourses, what is quite alarming is how the crisis of secularism across the region has an impact on Bangladeshi psychology, Bangladesh's makeover towards its neighboring country. Now, even if you look at CCAA particularly, that also gives us a kind of understanding that how the whole region is heading towards some sort of spillover effect on others. Certainly, if you look at the cultural makeup of South Asia, it is in any case has a greater propensity towards religious affiliation. And that is sometimes constructed as either extremism, given what kind of political belief you have. Now, when I look into Afghanistan, for an example, what happens? The first thing that you get to see, this is a Taliban 2.0, and 2.0 is fundamentally different than Taliban 1.0. And the 2.0 is a negotiator, a bargainer that has instant or constant communication with the rest of the world, may not be perhaps communicating with the South Asia as a whole. But if you look at that, Americans are talking to them, the Westerns are talking to them. And even if you look at this 2.0 mechanism, perhaps what kind of Taliban government are we looking in Kabul is kind of a hybrid Taliban 2.0, where you don't have the Pashtun dominance, but you also have the participation from other ethnic minority groups. Uh, the good part is that it has evolved towards a much more multi-ethnic entity, but the bad part in the whole system is whether everybody is at par regarding the future of Afghanistan and its relationship with the neighboring countries. Don't forget that there are new players within this particular domain, which is the Chinese, as well as the Russians, and in the new Russians particularly. Even if you look at what's happening in Ukraine, one particular group of people thinks that the unilateral withdrawal of United States from Afghanistan has really created conducive environment for Moscow to look into Ukraine from a very different prism by thinking that the West is no longer in the unified mood to deal with the Russian anxiety. Even if you look at the whole ecosystem that is unfolding, is the return of realpolitik. And in realpolitik, yes, Kirti was absolutely right that they're meeting in Norway. Obviously, but on the other hand, the question remains that how supportive South Asia has been to Afghanistan over this, particularly post Taliban takeover. Now, even if you look at Bangladesh as the country that has clearly articulated its policy towards Afghanistan by saying, if you don't deliver gender empowerment, if you don't deliver public services, if you don't deliver on the civic amenities, those are essentially creating conducive environment for radicalization to a great extent. Bangladesh doesn't seek to really engage with Afghanistan to a greater extent. But what we are now seeing, that probably the immediate neighbors are having different approach regarding Afghanistan, which does not really comply with what Bangladesh thinks. On the other hand, Bangladesh's policy is zero tolerance, what Rami was talking about. Yes, of course, this has been the case for many years now. I mean, it's more than a decade and a half. And decade and a half means that the country has essentially now embarked on the second generation of political ecosystem, in which you're now seeing that much more articulated, economically developed society being performing. And I'm quite sure if you take the data, probably we will be seeing much better economic performance, which Bangladesh aspires to deliver. On the other hand, the social resilience is perhaps in Bangladesh is being not understood, or even to great extent not been factored in this discussion. What happened to Bangladesh's social resilience? Yes, demand is one of the factors in 170 million population, and certainly it has its cloud. But on the other hand, it does reflect the overall society that Bangladesh is constantly exposing to the rest of the world. Now, even if you look at Bangladesh's relationship with Washington and Beijing, is perhaps gives you a clear understanding. The country moves beyond the myopic prism of what we call religious politico or political religiosity. Rather, it sees the whole economic security as much more of a prime factor, which is essential not only for Bangladesh, but also for the development and stability of the neighboring countries, including Myanmar. And when Bangladesh reached out to Myanmar, or rather when the Rohingyas came to Bangladesh and Bangladesh started to provide the Rohingyas a shelter, is perhaps perhaps one classic example by saying that the country essentially delivers on the human rights principles rather than the very verbatim of any particular religion doing what. So therefore, my last point is obviously Bangladesh's stability is certainly related to Indian, and Indian stability has implication on Bangladesh's stability too. So let us not forget that part of the story, and that stretches all the way from Afghanistan to all the way down to Myanmar. So therefore, as long as we don't understand the necessity of re-establishing secularism in the entire stretch of land, what I often refer to as the arc of instability, probably we will be doing a lot of futile exercise by just pointing out that ISI or something like that will be jeopardizing the entire system, whereas the onus lies within the political parties too. And the last point that I conclude with, even if you look at Afghanistan, how to deal with Afghanistan, can you deal with Afghanistan on a one-on-one basis? You can't. Even if you look at Pakistan-China relationship on Afghanistan, or in fact, collaboration, only mechanism that South Asia has is something called SARC, is essentially being hitched repeatedly. And we come up with like hundreds of sub-regional, and sub-regional programs, but essentially that is not going to solve any of the problems as we have seen so far. So therefore, I think the countries need to get together, act their perceptions right, and therefore deliver on that. Thank you.
Professor Khan, you make some important points. The most important, which is one of the reasons why we're discussing this, is that the instability in one country sort of transcends and moves across boundaries into another country. And we're going to talk about Pakistan as well in a bit. But Dr. Zahir, if I could just come to you and Maldives, compared to the other nations that we've been talking, Maldives is nation with a smaller population. And yet it has one of the highest risks of radicalization. And at one time, it had the highest number of foreign fighters per capita that were joining the Islamic State. What sort of impact do you see the events in Afghanistan having on potential radicalization of extremists in Maldives?
Yeah, no, thank you. No, you're absolutely right. Compared to the Taliban between 1996 and 2001, and the Taliban right now, the situation in the Maldives is very different now. As you mentioned, since with the rise of ISIS in 2014, we've seen a number of Maldivians going to Syria and Iraq. In fact, reports suggest that the Maldives might have been one of the largest per capita contributor of foreign fighters to Syria. Now, with that shows that there has been a new situation in the Maldives in terms of radicalization. A number of Maldivians have, in recent years, have been radicalized, and a lot of them support ISIS, but also some of them support groups like Al Qaeda. And we know that in recent years there have been increasing regional linkages between some of these Maldivians and regional groups, including ISIS-KP in Afghanistan, and also other groups in Pakistan, as well as reportedly based in India. So this creates really a lot of challenges to the Maldives, not because Maldives is a very small state with limited security and other resources at its disposal, but because mainly also we know that some Maldivians have already traveled to Afghanistan. There was a report that around 2018, there was one Maldivian family who fought with ISIS in Afghanistan. The family was arrested and sentenced. His name was Shafi, he was sentenced for 21 years in Afghanistan. And with the takeover of Kabul by Taliban in August last year, we know that he was released. It's very unclear what the situation there yet, but with these links, it creates more concern within Maldives that given the right circumstances, more Maldivians might travel to Afghanistan as well. So that's one set of problems the Maldives has to deal with: the rise of radicalization and the threat from terrorist groups in the region, and with security situation deteriorating in Afghanistan, that really intensifies these concerns in the Maldives as well. But besides that, we also have to understand that this situation is not only a bilateral concern for the Maldives. Any regional instability in South Asia really concerns the Maldives, especially because it's a small island state in South Asia. So increase in instability in South Asia, especially with respect to Pakistan and India, um, really decreases hope for regional cooperation and regional integration. Uh, SARC has already been a very dysfunctional association, but with increase in instability in South Asia, it really increases. Uh, it really means that we have uh, more and more, lack of hope for a functional SARC in the region, for example. But not only that, but also there are other issues like narcotics trafficking. That has been a huge issue for the Maldives. I mean, consignments and consignments of drugs have been busted recently in the Maldives. And again, this uh, instability in Afghanistan and deterioration of security, humanitarian situation, and economic situation in Afghanistan really adds to this problem. So there are a number of problems that a country like the Maldives has to grapple with the increase in instability in the region and in Afghanistan.
We can't discuss, of course, regional stability in Afghanistan without discussing Pakistan. So I just wanted to throw the question open to whoever would like to answer it. How is it? How has the victory? I mean, the strategic victory for the Pakistan army. What are the security challenges for Pakistan that come along with the Taliban victory in Kabul? What does it mean for internal security? What does it mean for violent extremism in Pakistan? And most importantly, what does it mean for the Pakistani Taliban? Whoever would like to answer it.
Uh, if I may add, I mean, just like briefly, because I don't look too much into Pakistan, but as far as I understand, as much as elements within Pakistan would have celebrated the Taliban's victory, there is also an equal amount of risk that is going to take place over there, right? And there are certain factors to consider. As far as I understand, I believe along the border areas of Afghanistan and Pakistan, there has been instability before. There is the issue of tribals, participating within the Taliban as well, and you also have the fact that at the end of the day, there are groups that have taken their strength from Afghanistan in the 1980s, but at some point pushed off at a point where they started targeting Pakistan itself. So, at the end of the day, when any country turns a blind eye on its own radicals and extremists, there will always be some level of consequence that will be taking place, in a few years' time down the line, right? And this is something that Pakistan will probably have to consider and will probably look into, when this moves. Now, another thing to also consider is Al Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent, which again, there has always been a debate about whether Al Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent has been Pakistani created. In fact, elements within Pakistan say it's Indian created. But the fact is that they are allied with the Taliban and they have spoken up even against Pakistan. Right, and if you and there was, I think, recently in November or September or November of 2021, one of their operatives was arrested in Pakistan, along with weapons and a few cache of explosives and so on. So you have the fact that these elements that all of the other nations in South Asia are looking at closely will create some sort of risk towards Pakistan as well. I mean, we've had attacks taking place in Pakistan, specifically targeted at the army or at the government, which at some point was, at some point or the other was supported or at least let go free by elements within Pakistan. So these are some aspects to consider when you're looking at what sort of security risk could take place for the country of Pakistan, right? Which is why they need to be stepping up their game quite significantly and trying, and this is something probably other nations in South Asia should take advantage of, at least to be able to force better cooperation as well as better scrutiny on the sort of groups that could create instability for the rest of South Asia, for India, for Bangladesh, for Maldives, and other nations in South Asia.
We've spoken a lot about Al Qaeda and how, of course, the Taliban victory does wonders for Al Qaeda, given that it's affiliated with the group. But what about groups? I'm talking about the Islamic State, the ISKP. What are groups that are not seen as part of the Taliban? We also know that the Islamic State serves a very important role now for those who disagree with the Taliban, for those just to provide an alternative choice for jihadists in Afghanistan. How do you see the brand of the Islamic State growing? What are the implications for ISKP or IS affiliates all around the world, given that the Islamic State operates on a very different brand than Al Qaeda? How do you see the Islamic State growing in the subcontinent? Anyone? Thoughts?
Well, my first thought to ISKP is that it might be, we might be giving it too much of importance. We don't know the kind of cadre it has. We don't know the kind of strength really that it has. It might not be as much. Also, the second thought that comes to mind is that, it could just be the good Taliban for, as it's projected to us, for us to look at it as, to distract us from really what is happening. So, it could be any of this. I think we need to see how it develops, under the Taliban government in another couple of months, maybe. But I don't think ISKP per se at this point can be given the kind of value that maybe some observers have been giving it.
Professor Khan, Dr. Zahid, would you share Rami's thoughts?
Yeah, I think Rami is pretty spot on this particular issue. IS and IS Khorasan and others. Right now, what is main problem for Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, or in that matter, the entire stretch, is this stability. In a sense, I refer back to Bangladesh's position on Afghanistan is quite clear, that it has to go back to its developmental state. Even if you look at today's data, but I think this is IMF or somebody who came up and they said that almost like 500,000 jobs have been lost. And then subsequently, you're now seeing almost like 9 to 10% children are pushed back to the worsening situation. Now, this is where I think being a state that believes in market and believes in economic stability really pushes the Afghans to deliver on the gender, deliver on the children's right, deliver on the labor right, and letting the people or the youth go back to the economic system once again. Now, we may always debate that whether pre-Taliban time situation was better or not. Definitely, the situation was better to a great extent. But certainly creating the environment for these people to function or refunction remains challenge for everyone. And that's exactly where the non-state actors such as ISKP or even the Pakistan-based Haqqani network or others can always pop up and take the advantage of the situation. Now that's where I think Rami's point comes up, that at the moment I think we should be more worried about Afghanistan, whether Afghanistan is going to create an environment where these non-state actors will have a better safe haven that they used to enjoy back in time, particularly 1991, 96, and subsequent years.
I agree with Professor Khan's analysis and Rami's as well. But having said that, I think it also depends on how effective a Taliban regime in Afghanistan in dealing with groups like ISKP. It's not only ISKP within Afghanistan that poses a challenge for South Asia, it's linkages with other groups. So, for example, from a Maldivian perspective, if you look at 2020, there was a very serious plot by a Maldivian group based in one of the islands where it was alleged they were trying to bomb a school chemistry laboratory. And we know that some of the people arrested, they had links with ISKP. And the leader of this Maldivian cell was allegedly directly appointed by ISKP. So again, with increasing instability and deteriorating security situation in Afghanistan, it could embolden ISKP, and that's really where really a lot of concerns arises for regional countries like the Maldives.
We've been talking to the Taliban being obligation for any state to recognize the Taliban, and even the last time the Taliban were in power, only 3 countries had recognized it. This time, of course, there are more states that have an interest in Afghanistan on matters of, defeating the Islamic State, mining, development, connectivity. But even if no one recognizes the Taliban, going forward, even if governments are dealing with it, would that still pose the same security threats in South Asia that we are sort of discussing today? Are we basically linking terrorism threats to recognition?
I think answer this, Kriti, if it is not a problem, because
Sure, go
this
ahead.
is one critical area which is the major challenge for all the countries, in fact, whether the terrorism prism or security prism would essentially help in stabilizing Afghanistan, or we should decouple these two fundamentally important national interest factors when we look into Afghanistan. I think whether Afghanistan receives any kind of recognition or not, Afghanistan is going to stay as it is. There are two reasons. So the first reason is the new geopolitical orbit, as I have mentioned earlier. I mean, whether the Indian subcontinent. I mean, when I take Indian subcontinent, starting from all the way to Pakistan down to Bangladesh, and taking our other neighbors on board. The problem lies is the new geopolitical reality where China, Pakistan, and Afghanistan orbit, and Afghanistan orbit with the Western. So these are the two sets of actors that we have to deal with in future. Now, the Chinese have their own interest, the Pakistanis have their own interest, and you now have the Central Asians, they have their own interest. And where does India, Bangladesh, and other countries stand in that whole two sets of actors? Probably far different, because of our own perennial problems of having crippling our own domestic structure of security as such. That's exactly where the Afghans are also worried, that how far they can actually come and engage with India and Bangladesh in that matter, or even Maldives and Sri Lanka. And that's where the foreign policy challenge lies. That's where the security discourse challenge lies. And I think this question deserves a greater discussion and debate, is whether we should still be looking at Afghanistan or Taliban 2.0 from the security point of view, or should we look into it from a development point of view? So far, Bangladesh's position is quite clear, which is essentially development that is linked with security. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Rami, go ahead.
I think when we talk about this situation, we look at it from the lens of India. I think for India, it's going to be very, very difficult to recognize the Taliban, and they'd possibly be better off supporting the NRF. Now, I say this because, again, I'm looking at it from the point of view of the northeastern region, which, again, is in a very, very precarious position, is connected to the mainland with just the chicken's neck. And now you have Myanmar, which is posing, a change in a regional balance. You see, China has vested interests in Myanmar, and China, through Pakistan, and with the aid of Taliban, is going to have some sort of impact on this region. And I think India is not in a position to be able to either take on the Tatmadaw at this point, or to be able to create a democratic resistance in Myanmar. So I think for India, when they look at the entire scenario of what they're surrounded by, I think they'd be better off in the hope that they can dislodge the Taliban, not today, whenever, the opportunity arises, then to recognize it, because recognizing it would have impacts on, the northeastern frontier, which are not going to be very easy. Having said that, I also do believe that, these are things that change very quickly, and already the Tatmadaw is very, very interested in maintaining an arm's length distance with China because of its interference in its, internal issues. So I think, somebody said earlier on that for regional balance, these kind of democratic institutions must be reinstated. I don't think it's going to happen. And I think it's not going to happen in Myanmar. I think there isn't a democratic opposition. And I think with the interference of China, and they're obviously going to take this sort of, they're going to take the line that Pakistan and Taliban takes, I think India's only option is to support the NRF for as long as it can.
We've spoken a lot about the security threat to South Asia that the Taliban pose. But as time goes on, what sort of impact does having a radical Islamist government in Afghanistan, what sort of impact does that have on political systems and political parties across the subcontinent? In Maldives, we've seen, of course, how political Islam can evolve and take various different forms. What does the Taliban government mean for political Islam in South Asia? Sure, Dr. Zahid.
Yeah. When the Taliban initially took over in Kabul in August last year, we saw that through social media, people from the Maldives were celebrating, people who were supporting a particular brand of Islam, I call them Islamists or more conservative, sort of more militancy, pro-militancy Salafis in the Maldives. They were celebrating the rise of Taliban in Afghanistan and the defeat of the withdrawal of US forces from Afghanistan. Now, this really, I think, shows that the Taliban government in Afghanistan could embolden these groups. Their narratives, their discourses, ideologies really encourage political parties and political groups.
Yeah, so I think, I mean, you're right. Like, I mean, at the end of the day, what Dr. Zahid told was about how, people did celebrate it at some point. And at the same time, to keep in mind is about what was the reason behind celebrations, because some people were just openly in celebration of the fact that, well, it's a Muslim or an Islamic emirate, so to say, right, that has won so far. But there were also other narratives where people were just like, okay, well, the Western, the US, which is also hated among a lot of countries as a colonial power, right? This has been defeated in Afghanistan. So there were two different reasons as to why people did celebrate. And I think when you understand the distinction between those two reasons, then we can understand where exactly will groups go from here, right? And what will they try to replicate this? What exactly will they try to do from here? At the end of the day, what also confuses, when you're talking about political Islam, what also confuses things is when you have issues like, for example, right now the Taliban is in Norway having peace talks, right? And the fact is that, even to come on the table over there is definitely some level of recognition that is being given to them purely on the fact that, well, there's no other credible or no other powerful actor that can be spoken, which is representing Afghanistan, and the fact that obviously they control the government there, right? So when down the line there will be, and if there are any countries that start speaking more and more because of, as other panelists have mentioned, because of vested interests in Afghanistan, because of the fact that, well, there are issues like mining, like defeating like the Islamic State, so on and so forth. When these countries start speaking more to the Taliban, you will then also have that playing an impact with political Islamic or political Islamist groups, right? Which would say things like, well, you have other countries which are legitimate actors talking to the Taliban, so why don't, why can't we also believe that, well, there is something good about about this people? Now, whether that comes to fruition or not, I'm not sure, but there are these possibilities that can occur as well, and that's something to keep in mind. And that's also adding hopefully to what Dr. Zahir had mentioned about people celebrating the rise or the victory of the Taliban, so to say.
So we've spoken about this. We've spoken about all the problems that the Taliban coming to power means for South Asia. And we know what we don't want in Afghanistan. We don't want the situation that it is in today. This is sort of the worst case possible scenario for South Asia. But is there any sort of consensus, or is it very optimistic of me to expect consensus among South Asian nations on what is it that we do want in Afghanistan? What is it that we can do, and what is it that we would want now, given the situation, given what the situation is today?
I think the first issue is, I mean, if you ask me, I mean, as South Asian, I mean, the South Asian countries, the first thing is to understand what Afghan population wants. And for that, we really need to have a synchronized foreign policy across the region. Now, when I mention synchronized foreign policy, what does it mean? I mean, Bangladesh may have a development as the priority, but others may not. And that's where the problem is. That's why I was mentioning that you have one set of actors in the eastern orbit, and then you have another set of actors in the western orbit. And where does India, Bangladesh fit into that? That's a question. Now, that's where I think the greater Bangladesh being one of the proponent which still believes in regionalism, which believes in multilateralism, believes that we need to strengthen our multilateral approach. And multilateral approach cannot be always like coming down to every other day a new sort of sub-regional subsets. Now, that's where I think we need to have a greater understanding. Now, how far can Pakistan be cooperative over here? How far the Pakistan alliances as well, or the Russian alliances will be functional when you have the Americans as the key factors over there too? So I think there is two sets of approach that is extremely important, which is the regional consensus on the problem, and where you need to have the foreign policy beyond our myopic understanding of one state. And the second one is to engage, as you have seen that the Qataris and others have engaged other countries in the whole process. And that's where exactly Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, and countries like that should come up and club themselves together for engaging with the extra-regionals. And unless you have your regional outfit right, you can't really expect to deal with the presence of extra-regional entities coming here. I mean, if you look at trade as an example, if you look at connectivity as an example, for everything you have to depend on the extra-regionals these days, because we don't have our own internal mechanisms fixed together. Even sometimes, even after all these years, we still talk about whether South Asians have intra-regional trade to an extent which can be even considered as bare minimum. Even if you look at Southeast Asia, has more than 25% intra-regional trade, and then subsequently they're now part of regional comprehensive economic partnership, which is one of the largest economic partnership, which includes China, which includes even Australians, and all of them coming together. So we haven't been part of that. So this is where I think two subsets needs to be understood and delivered subsequently. Thank you.
So regional consensus on what the problem is and a synchronized foreign policy, and not two subsets.
We know the problems.
Yep.
We know the solutions. Whether we know how to act on these solutions is a question.
I agree with that. Thoughts of the panel? Yes, Rami.
I really think from India's perspective, India has so much of goodwill on ground, and I think we should not lose on that. I think supplying Afghanistan with humanitarian aid, material, supplying NRF with military means, as India has done with the Northern Alliance before, I think would be would be a smarter way to move for India. Having said that, I don't think India physically should be in Afghanistan. We've already seen what America being in Afghanistan has done, and I think that would be a miscalculation. But considering that India has developmental projects in all 38 districts of Afghanistan, and considering that, it has given refuge to, the Afghani population, and on ground, the Afghani population is in sync and very fond of the Indian population, I think that is something that we can build on. But beyond that, I really don't think India should or can engage with the Taliban until and unless it watches and sees what sort of interrelationships it builds with China. China has already made its move. It's already offered it two things that it really needed. It needed economic support, and it needed some sort of, legitimacy. which China has given it, and we know why China is doing that, So I think India on that front needs to wait and watch, and India needs to do what is pretty much important for it at this point, which is to keep the goodwill that it has with the Afghani people.
Sinan, Dr. Zahir, your final thoughts on what is the potential for South Asia to come together, sort of help alleviate the horrific humanitarian crisis that's happening in Afghanistan? Your thoughts on that?
I think one of the things that we need to keep in mind when we're looking at cooperation in South Asia is that it has always been difficult, right? And especially on the aspect of security, especially on the aspect of, okay, are we recognizing the Taliban or not? These aspects will always have some level of disagreement. There will always be a lot of vested interest. There will always be geopolitics coming into play. However, when you focus the question on specifically the humanitarian issue, I think that's something that most of all the countries should agree on, right? And should take steps to cooperate on, because at the end of the day, of course there are geopolitical interests, but at the end of the day, it's the human beings who are there, and it's not their fault at the end of the day that they're ruled by a government that maybe other countries in South Asia don't specifically like, right? So India has been doing a good job, as Remy mentioned. India has sent in medical supplies. They have developmental projects going in over there, and this is something that a lot of the other countries obviously are probably engaged in, or should be engaging in. Now, what that means on on a cooperation level would probably need to, there needs to be conversation, and there needs to be dialogue happening between the different nations over here, specifically on, okay, let's not discuss security for now. Let's try to discuss how do we alleviate the issue. Let's try to respond with emergency aid and supplies and so on, and from there we can take it forward in terms of what exactly happens. Because even when we noticed when India has provided medical supplies, the Taliban did comment that, despite the fact that India is still very harsh on Taliban, specifically regarding terrorism. But these are talking points that help to move the conversation a little bit forward, to get some leverage for all the nations in South Asia. And I believe that if cooperation is taken very seriously on a humanitarian issue, that does spill over into the political, geopolitical, as well as the security aspects of the problem in Afghanistan as well. And I think that's something to keep in mind when we're looking at cooperation.
Just to add to Sinan, I mean, I don't want to really divert this discussion, but just to add to Sinan, even if you look at the COVID time, I mean, Prime Minister Modi invited all the countries to talk, and every country had their own barter to offer. And that actually proved to be an outstanding spirit. Now, if that can be done, if that COVID was a classic example on public health, which knows no boundary, and the security, the future modalities of security will not be looking into any kind of boundary. I mean, one mobile phone is good enough to really create a havoc everywhere. So again, you're now talking to returning to the borderless, boundaryless security issue. So it is never ending. So therefore, I think even if you go back to that COVID time discussion held by Prime Minister Modi itself is a classic example that it is doable.
Yeah, no, absolutely. No,
Dr. Zahir, your final
I
thoughts
agree.
on potential for cooperation.
No, I absolutely agree with the rest of the speakers on the prospects for cooperation. From a small state's perspective, like Maldives, I think it's absolutely necessary that there should be greater regional cooperation. But unfortunately, it's becoming increasingly difficult to have a regional response to situations like Afghanistan. There can be these countries like India that there have been definitely more bilateral responses to that, but it's increasingly becoming difficult to have a regional response to situations like Afghanistan because of a number of familiar problems that we have faced in South Asia between India and Pakistan, and now increasingly because of the complications from the rivalry between China and India and Pakistan as well. So that's really unfortunate. But so far, the Maldivian government has been hesitant in extending, in recognizing the Taliban regime. Definitely, it would follow the line of countries like India in this regard. But I think the main concern from the Maldivian perspective is the human rights situation in Afghanistan and the security implications from the rise of Taliban in Afghanistan. But we have to set aside these concerns when it comes to humanitarian situation in Afghanistan, and it's the right thing to cooperate regionally to respond to that.
Well, unfortunately, the situation in Afghanistan worsens every day in what promises to be a brutal winter country. And as we've discussed today, Afghanistan's neighbors, we're still waiting and watching, all while realizing the serious political and security implications that the Taliban has on our respective countries. The fallout from the Taliban being in power will unravel slowly and steadily, of course, over the next few months and a couple of years. And whether different nations choose to recognize it or not, I think we've discussed here today that the existence of a radical militant group in power in Afghanistan has long lasting consequences for regional security and national security for the South Asian countries. Thank you so much for all of you for joining us today and discussing this topic. Thank you.